Hello everybody, welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. My guest today is Dr. Richard Nisbett. He is the Theodore M. Newcomb Distinguished Professor of Social Psychology and co-director of the Culture and Cognition program at the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. He was the recipient of the Donald T. Campbell Award from the American Psychological Association in 1992, and he is also a Guggenheim Fellow. He is also the author of several books, including Culture of Honor, The Geography of Thought, and Mindware. Dr. Nisbett, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show.
Thank you.
Okay, great. So I guess that in your work, and because you do work on social psychology, you put a great emphasis on the effects that the environment has on human psychology. But do you look at it as all people sharing the same evolved cognitive functions, and these functions processing different inputs of information, or how does it work really?
Well, I think we're endowed with certain cognitive skills, certain ways of perceiving and understanding the world, but we have no idea what those are. Because the only way we get smart is through culture. 20 years ago, for some people in psychology, even 5 years ago, or now, the story on intelligence, which is reasoning ability, was that the intelligence that you have is basically what you were born with, and it sort of just unfolds as you get older, and it's not much affected by school, it's not much affected by what goes on in the home, it's not that much affected by the general environment like the culture. And I could get into the details if you like, but I will say every bit of that is totally wrong. Genes are much less important than is generally assumed, and family environments are much more important than has been assumed in the past. And the culture is much more important.
Yes, but are you, for example, sympathetic to the idea of culture-gene coevolution? That is, a culture creating new environmental pressures that, with time, also have some effect in terms of genetic evolution?
That seems highly plausible to me. My own thoughts about evolution and the press of the environment on making us smarter only go back about 200 years to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. It's hard to believe how unintelligent by our standards the average person was. He was probably a farmer in Europe or in North America. They were largely incapable of abstract thought. For example, even early in the past century in Russia, there was a psychologist who found a group of people who had no education at all. I mean, they'd never been to elementary school. And he would do little tests. He would do things like say, as you know, all of the bears in the north are white. And then a little bit later, he would say, I had a letter from a friend recently. He lives in the north. He told me that he saw a bear. What color do you suppose it was? And the person would say, how should I know? Ask your friend who saw the bear. So the basic structure of if P then Q, P is the case, therefore Q is the case, just isn't there. And now, of course, these people got along perfectly well in their everyday life. They just couldn't do an abstraction which seems like second nature to us. Or they were incapable of so-called counterfactuals. very difficult to think about a state of the world that doesn't exist and what would be the case if that were to be true. My favorite example of this comes from Jim Flynn. He's 85 years old now, and one of the most important people in the intelligence field, the person who showed beyond a shadow of a doubt the incredible importance of culture in making people intelligent. Jim, I don't think he would mind me saying this, has a tested IQ of 184. But he's not as smart as his son, who is a professor of pure mathematics at Oxford University. But Jim's father had only less than a grade school education. I mean, he had a few years of grade school. And if he were to say something to his father was quite a prejudiced man, and if he were to say something about blacks that offended Jim, he might say, well, how would you feel about that if you were black? And his father would say, don't be ridiculous. I'm not black. I couldn't be black. I mean, just incapable of taking this given of a new world. I mean, I live in the world I live in. So the why did we get smarter? I mean, not clear. I think the Industrial Revolution had everything to do with it. It made everybody have to read and write. And then for free, we got logic, the ability to think in terms of abstractions and so on. And the degree to which we can do those things and to have an improvement in reasoning skills in general has just continued to increase. So that over the last 70 years or so, in the OECD nations, that is the advanced European nations and North America and so on, the IQ has increased by about 18 points. This is enormous. I mean, it's the difference between someone who would be expected to at most go to a community college, a two-year school, and have an occupation like assistant store manager or a tradesman of some sort, or secretary. Of course, that's a job category that no longer exists, but that's an IQ of 100. Now, the average person has always had an IQ of 100 because that's the way IQ tests are defined. Whatever the mean is, whatever, it's a 160 item test and the average number that people get right is 82. Okay, 82, we'll call that 100. 18 points is more than a standard deviation higher than that. So the a person in 1947 with an IQ of 100 would actually have an IQ 18 points below what the IQ average is today, and that person would in fact be incapable of much less in the way of reasoning and abstraction. So, and then in other countries, just sort of below the OECD economic development level, there's now huge increases that we're seeing in IQ. In Brazil, for example, over about a 30-year period, it's been like a 10 or 12 point IQ increase. I mean, it's absolutely enormous. So just in terms of the things that IQ tests measure, the culture turns out to be critically important. It's changing rapidly and continuing to press us toward being smarter in different ways. My own work, I don't know where you want to go from here. I can talk about my own work, which is about cognitive skills that are not tested by IQ tests, but that are very important to have.
Yes, but let me just ask you, you talked about the example of IQ or general intelligence, but would you say that, for example, in other types of cognitive skills like social cognition or even certain cognitive biases that we have, and you studied some of them, would you say that at least those sorts of things that are related also to cognitive processes, that they at least are partly innate or not?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, genes are always important. I mean, they've been estimated variously to be somewhere between 50%. Genes account for 50%, 60%, 80% of the variation in IQ in the population. But it turns out that the degree to which genes are important is culturally dependent, or subculturally dependent. For upper middle class people, the contribution of genes to the intelligence variation in that group of people is about 80%. I mean, if you're upper middle class, most of your intelligence, how you differ from other people, is influenced by genes. But for lower socioeconomic status people in OECD countries, the contribution is around 20%. So it's the contribution to the share of variance in the population of lower class people accounted for by genes. Why should there be this difference? Well, I think it's because in upper middle class families, they don't differ much with respect to the kinds of things that make you smart. They're all substantial. There's not much of a difference between Dr. Jones's family and Lawyer Smith's family. So in that situation where environments are not terribly different, genes will be driving the bus and they'll account for the whole thing. At the other extreme, for lower socioeconomic status people, the environment ranges from as good as you would ever find in an upper middle class family to chaotic and disruptive in every respect. And if the environment is differing a great deal, it's the environment that's going to be driving the bus. So people's IQ, lower socioeconomic status people's IQ, is largely dependent on the quality of the environment, which varies a lot from one family and neighborhood to another.
Okay, so what is your opinion about evolutionary psychology and the idea that the mind is innately endowed with cognitive modules? Do you agree with this idea, or do you think that we simply have, let's say, domain general learning mechanisms?
Oh, I'm very sympathetic with the evolutionary psychology position that there are modules for all kinds of things. Having said that, I don't think we have a clue really of what's in those modules, except for the language module. And I think it's very convincing there that we are all born with a set of skills, verbal skills, that make us all get language, whether we want it or not. We get it automatically. We're wired for it. But I have not that much patience with evolutionary psychologists who will start telling me that there's a module for murder, even a module for murder of a sexual rival. To me, that's sheer speculation. We are all the same in many ways that have been determined by evolution. It's very hard to figure out what those might be because there's such a huge overlay of culture that we all have that's modified those things in ways that we wouldn't have guessed. I mean, 30 or 40 years ago, no one would have. I mean, the position in the IQ world was that IQ is IQ, and it's everybody has some, and some have more and less for others, and the differences are largely genetically determined. That's mistaken.
I wanted to ask you about a specific thing that you studied in terms of cultural differences in cognitive abilities, let's say. And then I wanted for you to explain to us how this occurs. That is, for example, in your book, The Geography of Thought, you talk about basically some cognitive differences that you studied between Eastern and Western cultures. For example, in the way Eastern people seem to be more collectivistic and have a more holistic approach to the world, right? And Western people, on the other hand, tend to be more individualistic and pay more attention to isolated components of the environment. So could you talk about these differences and what is at on their basis?
Okay. Well, I take a strongly evolutionary kind of position on this, though not assuming that the genetic equipment has necessarily been much influenced by it. But broadly speaking, China, which is where modern Eastern culture comes from, was an agricultural society. It's ideal for big-scale agriculture. There's plains with rivers running through it. Irrigation is easy. So people are farmers. And farmers have to get along with each other. They have to cooperate, for example, in sharing water. And this is particularly true for rice culture, which requires an enormous amount of cooperation at various points during the growing cycle. Things were very different in Greece, which is the source of modern Western culture. In Greece, you have mountains descending to the sea. There's no plains to speak of. So the occupations there are hunting, fishing, kitchen gardening, trading, and so on, none of which require complex social relations. And I think that's the origin, I think, of the Eastern collectivism versus the Western individualism. And now, these socio-emotional differences gave rise to substantial cognitive differences. So, people in the West are what I call analytic thinkers, which means that they focused on some object that's important to them. They note its categories. They bring to the fore rules which apply to those categories, and then they model the behavior of that object with respect to manipulating it. And the object could be a human being. I mean, there's constant modeling of the world in terms of categories and rules and logical operations. Now, everybody does that to some degree, but it's much more characteristic of Westerners than it is of Easterners. And what's more characteristic of Easterners is a holistic view where you pay attention to the object in relation to its environment, and you're concerned about relationships between objects and the environment, and between the object and its environment, and you attend to similarities, and there's a more holistic view of the world. Now, there are cognitive skills associated with both of these kinds of ways of operating, and I don't want to be too extreme here. Everybody's got both ways of operating, but the default is very different in the West than it is in the East. And we are able to show that with all kinds of experiments. So we can show that, for example, if you show people a picture of a banana, a monkey, and a rabbit, and you ask people which two go together, the Westerner says, well, the monkey and the rabbit go together because they're both animals. They both have the same category. If you ask Easterner the same thing, the Easterner is likely to say, well, the banana goes with the monkey because monkeys eat bananas. So our most striking research actually comes to a very low level of cognition, literally at the level of perception. We show people 20-minute videos of what looks like an underwater scene of some kind. They're actually cartoons, but they look quite realistic. We show them for 20 seconds, and at the end, we say, tell me what you saw. An American will say, and in fact, Westerners in general, will say, I saw 3 big fish swimming off to the left. They had white bellies and red stipples on them. They had double fins on their back. A Japanese person will start by saying, I saw what looked like a stream. The water was green. There were shells and rocks on the bottom. And there were 3 big fish swimming off to the left. Now, and that's a huge difference, what you start with. The American says, what this is all about is the exciting objects, the most salient objects. And for the Asian, East Asian, what it's all about is this whole picture, the whole environment, in which there are some very interesting objects, to be sure. We actually put an apparatus on people's eyes, in front of their eyes, so that we can see what they're looking at pictures at every moment. Americans spend almost all their time looking at the object, and Easterners are constantly looking back and forth between the object and the environment. And later, when you ask people what they saw, what they've seen before. I'm going to show you a picture. I want you to tell me what of an object. I want you to tell me whether you've seen that object before or not. Some of the time we show the object in the original environment, and some of the time we show the object in a different environment. If you show the object in a different environment, Japanese are quite likely to get it wrong. They say, I haven't seen that before. They haven't seen that object in that environment, but they've seen the object before. Americans throw away the environment. It doesn't make any difference at all. The object is what they were paying attention to. Doesn't bother them. They show it in a different environment. Doesn't matter. They haven't coded the object in relation to its environment. Now this has ramifications through intellectual history. The ancient Greeks thought analytically. So Aristotle said a stone drops if you put it into water because it has the property of gravity. Now, there's a problem there because if you put a piece of wood in the water, it floats. That problem solved, though. The piece of wood has the property of levity. Everything's understood in terms of the object. This would have always have seemed bizarre to people in the East, because it was always understood that gravity is a relationship between objects. It's not something that inheres in a particular object. And as a consequence of this broad, holistic understanding of the world, the ancient Chinese understood the reason for the tides, which escaped even Galileo, because it's, it always still seems pretty strange to me. What, you mean the moon that far away affecting things on Earth? Give me a break. I mean, so, but it was always a natural way of thinking for people in the East. So, and now, back to the evolutionary story, ecology is dictating economy is dictating social relations, and in the East, you have to pay attention to other people. To be effective means coordinating with other people. In the individualistic West, to be effective means getting it right about the object and what you can do to it and how you can influence it. And I even attribute the difference in logic to this. I mean, logic is a more powerful source of thought in the West than in the East. The story goes here. Where did we get logic? Well, Aristotle got sick of hearing lousy arguments in the marketplace and the political assembly. So he said, okay, can we agree that if your argument has this structure, it's a crummy argument? This is really the story that philosophers of logic tell, and it's a wonderful story. I hope it's true. But in the East, you wouldn't need rules for dealing with conflicting opinions because you don't have conflicting opinions. I mean, for a Japanese, it's very difficult to have a conversation if you've never had a conversation with someone who's Japanese, because pretty soon it gets onto the question of Donald Trump or the most recent Spike Lee movie, whatever. And this is dangerous, because if I like the recent Spike Lee movie and I find that you don't like it, we've got a problem if we're Japanese. If we're Westerners, no problem. Okay, you like it, I don't like it. You're a communist, I'm a capitalist, no problem. And so argumentation was very uncommon in the East, and it wasn't necessary, therefore, to have rules about what's a smart thing to say in conversation.
Yes, and what is the element or the elements of culture that influence this sort of default cognition that people have when they live in different cultures? So, I mean, is it driven by what? By language? By concepts? What is it exactly in the culture that makes people have these default cognitive ways of looking at things?
It's a great question. I don't really know that I have that much to say about it, except to say that languages are themselves very different, East and West, and I'm no expert on linguistics, but I've been told that Eastern languages, well, here's a finding, so it's a very striking finding. If you put mothers of young children, a year and a half old, you put them in a room and you give them toys and you watch how they interact with the toys. An American mother says, "Look, Billy, see, it's a truck. See, it has nice wheels." The Japanese mother says, "It's a vroom vroom. I give it to you. You give it to me. Yes, thank you." It's all about socio-emotional stuff, certainly in Japanese, or I'm not so sure that it's quite as strongly true in Korea or China, but we certainly know in Japan. You have to teach socio-emotional skills to an Easterner to deal with this fact that effective operation depends on integrating your behavior with other people. In the West, it's not so true. And we have a very recent finding looking at reasoning about social conflict. For example, we actually give, I'm sure you have something equivalent to the Dear Abby column in Portugal, where you say, "I have the following problem, help me with it." And it's the newspapers, every newspaper's got one columns like that. So we give people these problems. So one problem might be, my brother passed, my father passed away a year ago, and my sister went and bought a gravestone for $2,000 and told me she'd done it, and then told my brother that we should kick in and pay our share. But I don't really have the money, and I don't think it's right that she did it without asking me, what should I do? There are big stylistic differences, which it has to do with everything to do with holistic versus analytic reasoning, and I think with wisdom, because the Japanese are confronted with these kinds of problems. They take the perspective of the different parties. Westerners are much more likely to zero in on one person, take the perspective only of the guy who's written the note. There's the understanding by Japanese that the situation will change. It's unstable. Something's going to be different. Whereas Americans, and actually this is a very striking difference between Westerners and Easterners. The default for the world is constant change to Easterners. The default, and I don't really know how to explain this, the default in the West is stability. The world is going to be exactly like it was now, and if it's going to be different, it's going to be different in a linear way. So if the world was here at one point and it's there at this point, where is it going to be at some later time step? Well, the American will tell you it'll be there. It'll be a straight line. The Chinese will tell you it's going to be curvilinear. And incidentally, this habit of mine can get people. It's a two-edged sword. All of the skills, the cognitive skills that are characteristic of the Westerner, and all of the skills that are characteristic of the Easterner, are in general good and help you solve problems. The world is constantly changing to the Easterner. The world is pretty much stable to the Westerner. I don't know why that's true, but I must say my sympathies, and in general my sympathies, lie with the Easterner. I mean, I think there's something called the fundamental attribution error. I don't know if this is a common concept in Europe and the U.S. When people take social psychology, the first thing we say to them is a fundamental attribution error. Watch out for it. It means assuming that people's behavior is produced by their traits, personality traits, their skills, something from the person. And you can show that this is often wrong because you put people in situations which are having a massive effect on their behavior, and other people observing this don't realize this, and they think they're seeing, the person's extroversion or the introversion. They don't realize the importance of the environment. Easterners are much less likely to make that error. They're likely to pick up on situational differences. They're likely to see what those are due to. Well, all of this is not really answering your question, which is, what is it exactly about these ecological differences, the economic differences, and then the social orientation differences that are producing these cognitive differences? I mean, honestly, I'm not going to go further because I'd just be waving my hands. But somehow, it does. These things. And we know. I'm not waving my hands when I say that the economy is producing the social differences, and that the social differences are producing the cognitive differences. We did a study recently in Turkey where we looked at we looked at people in one community. Some of them, the occupation was farmer. Some of them it was fishermen, and these are people who fish on the open sea in big boats, and there are a lot of them on the boats. These are occupations which require interaction with other people and coordination with other people. And we compared the reasoning of these people to herding people who don't have to deal with other people. They just have to deal with sheep. And there's no question of argument with the sheep. The sheep's going to do what you and the dog say. And they have different cognitions. They think very differently. The farmers and fishers are thinking in terms of the whole broad environment. The herders are thinking just in terms of the object. And then the lovely study that was done recently, it's one of my favorite social. People don't do the wonderful old social psychology studies that they used to do about behavior. Now everybody just get on the internet and start asking questions. But there's a wonderful behavioral study done where an investigator went into Starbucks in southern China, which is rice agriculture, and northern China, which is wheat agriculture and substantially less requirement for cooperation in northern China. Did I say east or west? I meant southern China, rice, collectivist, northern China, wheat, somewhat more individualistic. So the investigators put the chair in a corridor. Put a chair in the corridor where you can get around it and you have to sort of squeeze around it, or you can just move the damn thing, get it out of your way. In the south, in the rice growing region, they creep around the chair. In the north, they move the damn thing out of the way so they can do it easier. So it's a question of altering your environment in a way that's better for you versus accommodating to the environment and not making waves. So.
Mm-hmm. Okay, but whatever the elements of culture that influence the default cognition that is prevalent in each culture, whatever they might be, a very important thing here is that they are not deterministic. That is, if we tell people to use a different frame of reference than the one that is prevalent in the culture they live in, they are able to do it, right?
That's right. What I'm talking about is default differences. I mean, in all kinds of ways, of course, there are no differences of interest to me between Easterners and Westerners, cognitive differences or perceptual differences, but there are a lot of them. And they're not, as you say, deterministic. One of my very favorite studies that was done in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is a wonderful test bed because it's completely Eastern and it's completely Western. I mean, it's a Chinese city which had an English culture imposed on it for 100 years. And you can have people do the kinds of tasks, cognitive and perceptual tasks that we do. But first, you show these people in Hong Kong pictures that remind them of America, cowboys, the capital, and so on. Or you show them pictures that remind them of Chinese culture, temples and dragons and so on. The ones who've seen the American pictures reason more like Americans. They perceive things more like that. They zero in on that salient fish. The people who've been primed, that's the word we psychologists use, primed for Chinese culture, think more holistically. They perceive, they pay more attention to the environment when they perceive the world. So just within that same culture, you know, but the general point is true for everything. You can do things to me that will make me think like an East Asian. I mean, reminding me of the importance of the context, making me pay attention to other people's social behavior in some way before I start explaining some event. So, but I don't. The fact that we can all reason in both ways, it's true, but the defaults are there, they're different, and for some things they're huge. The perceptual things are the most striking to me. I mean, Japanese see 60% more relationships in these fish pictures than the Americans do. And by the way, at no cost to how much they're perceiving in the object. They see the same, they can tell you the same amount of stuff about the object. Meanwhile, for free, they're telling you all of this stuff about the environment. And that's a real skill. I mean, it's, good for the Japanese that they've got this broader view that causes them to see more of the world.
Yes, and a thing that people from all cultures have in common when it comes to these cognitive processes is that most of them, and the ones we've been talking about here, occur at a subconscious level, right? People are not really aware of most of the cognition or the cognitive processes that go around in their minds, right?
Right. That actually, some of my earliest work was done on this, showing that people are, we don't know why we come to the conclusions we come to. We don't know what the cognitive processes were. And I take a very strong stand, which seems too strong to most people when you first hear it. We are unable to observe cognitive process of any kind that go on in our head. What we know is what the inputs were, some of them, not all of them, and we know what the output was, the conclusion or the behavior, and what goes on in between is completely obscure from us. We don't know. We're usually right. I mean, if I swerve to avoid a squirrel, and you say, "Why did you swerve?" I say, "Well, I was trying to avoid the squirrel." That's not a cognitive process. I mean, you could have said the same thing about me if you had noticed the squirrel. Hey, you swerved to avoid the squirrel. But we did a very large number of studies showing that people are dramatically ignorant of things that are influencing their thought. And there's been an avalanche of these kinds of studies. And I mean, if you put people, I just voted yesterday in a church, and if you have people vote in a church, they're more likely to vote against abortion, for example. They're more likely to vote in ways that their religion would tell them to vote. If you have them vote in a school, but if you have a school millage, that is a tax to support the school more, you get more support for that if they vote if the voting place is a school than if it's a church. I mean, there are a million people. I mean, there's some of these contextual things are tremendously important. I mean, which influence our reasoning. Being in a green environment makes us happier, and it makes us more creative than other environments like red or pink or orange. And one of my very favorite studies, Israeli judges who are judging whether there should be a prisoner should be paroled. If they do have the hearing of this, listen to this prisoner just before lunch, they're unlikely to parole him. If it's right after lunch, they're more likely to parole him. Now, if you were to say to the judge, by the way, do you know that you probably paroled that guy because you just had a nice lunch? You'd say, give me a break. I mean, in fact, I did studies like this, showing, manipulating what people did. I know, and they did exactly what I thought. And then you ask them, could that thing have influenced them? They get mad at you. I mean, say, give me a break. I mean, I know what was going on in my head, and that was not a part of it. Well, yes, it was.
Yeah, so would you say that we perform a certain action or make a decision, and then when after the fact we're asked to provide reasons why we did so, that most of what we say or all of what we say even is nothing but post-hoc rationalizations?
Well, I wouldn't say just rationalizations, it's inferences. I say, well, these are the inputs that I'm aware of, these are the outputs, the judgments, and the behavior. And most of the time, I'm probably going to be right. Certainly about trivial everyday things. But it's so easy to show that people can be drastically wrong. I mean, massively influence their behavior with some trivial manipulation of the environment. They have no idea that that's what caused their behavior. We have we have our psychology. Most of us share the same lay psychological understanding, and that's what we draw on. We draw on these lay psychological theories to explain our own behavior and our own judgments. It feels like we're interrogating what went on inside our head. We're not. We're interrogating what our rules are for understanding human behavior and human cognition. It's easy to show that people will have the same interpretations of why they did something as the interpretations they offer for other people. And if they're right about other people, they'll be right for themselves. If they're wrong about other people, they'll be wrong about themselves. I mean, it's because they're reading off the theories, they're not reading off the mental events. We have no idea what those mental events are. I mean, which gets back to your question of what are the mental events that are giving rise to these cognitive and so I've just been giving you the reasons why I can't tell you. I don't know.
Yeah, right. So, okay, so the last topic I would like to address with you today, Dr. Nisbett, is and because you studied a lot these things and you wrote about them in the book Culture of Honor, the difference between people in the southern and the northern states of the United States of America. So, because it seems to me, at least as far as I understand it, that it has some very interesting reasons that have to do with the social and economic organization of the people that settled the northern states as opposed to the southern states of the United States. But they also have to do with the geography of the specific places they settled. So could you talk a little bit about this, please?
Right. Well, the north of the U.S. was settled by farmers. English, German farmers, Dutch. The south of the United States was in general settled by herding people who raised cattle or sheep for a living. And if you're a herder, and anthropologists hate generalizations, but when you give them this generalization, they grimace, but they have to agree it's true. All over the world, herding people are tough guys. And they have to be tough guys because you can take my entire livelihood, all of my wealth, you can take in an instant. So to make sure that you don't mess with me, if you do anything that I find offensive in any way, an intrusion, then I treat that as if it's an insult to be dealt with in an extreme manner, with physical punishment. You know, at least take that back or you'll be sorry. So I started the research. I'm from El Paso, Texas, which is a southern state, definitely a herding state. Initially, nobody does herding anymore, but I mean, historically a herding state. And I went to college in Boston, and it seemed like a totally different country to me. Still does. And one of the first things you notice as a southerner going to the north is that people seem rude. And they're not stepping on their tippy toes to make sure that they don't offend you. They just say whatever the hell they like. If if you don't like it, so much the worse for you. So, and I didn't like that aspect, I must say, about the North. But after a while, I realized something else about the North, which is that middle-class people don't kill each other in the North. And they did in Texas. I mean, while I was growing up, the school superintendent shot the president of the school board, or the other way around. One way or the other, I don't know which. I actually have a relative who shot her husband when she caught him with the maid. So, I mean, she was definitely middle class. She was the society editor of the local newspaper at the time she did this. So, first thing I did was to document that the homicide rate is higher in the South than in the North. I actually spoke to an anthropologist who said, well, it's the herding difference is what's going on. So, well, really? If that's the case, then the elevated homicide rate in the South probably is restricted to cases where there's been an insult. Now, marvelous to say, the FBI keeps track of the circumstances of murders. So if the thing occurred in a context where an insult is likely, it's an argument with a neighbor, a love triangle, a barroom fight, it's these murders that are elevated in the South. The convenience store murders, where somebody shoots the guy behind the cash register, are equally common in the South and the North. So it isn't that Southerners are bloodthirsty; it's just that you better watch what you say with them. And as a Southern sociologist friend of mine says, if you stay out of the wrong beds and bar rooms in the South, you're perfectly safe. So, at any rate, and then this is my absolute favorite study ever, to show that there is this difference in response to insults. We insulted University of Michigan students who were either from the South or from the North. They walk down a narrow hallway to deposit a questionnaire somewhere, and they have to go past somebody who's got, it's a very narrow hall, and he's got a drawer, file drawer pulled out, who's working on it, and he has to push that file drawer in to let the guy by. The guy puts the questionnaire around, person's pulled out the file drawer again, but now he has to push it again to let the guy go past. So this guy, the guy who's at the file drawer, who of course is our employee, slams the door shut, pushes into the subject's shoulder, and says, "Asshole." And we now have observers watching the reaction. For Northerners, it's sort of, what's your problem? For Southerners, they flush, they get the instant anger. In a variation of this study, we have people, we measure testosterone level, which of course underlies aggression, and cortisol level, which underlies stress. I mean, if you're stressed, you have it. The Southerners who are insulted have an increase in testosterone level, you have an increase in cortisol level. Southerners don't have an increase. Northerners don't have an increase, whether they've been insulted or not. And in one variation, we send people back down that hall after they've either been insulted or not. And marching down the hall is a guy who is, 2 meters tall, maybe a little more, and heavy set. His night job is bouncer. And his instructions are to march down the middle of the hall and not to stand aside, no matter what. So Northerners stand aside to let the guy pass when he's about 5 feet away. And they do this whether they've been insulted or not. Southerners, remember, one of the good things about Southerners, they're polite, they're not rude. So if the Southerner has not been insulted, he stands aside at about 9 feet away. After you, sir. But if he's just been insulted, he goes up to, he's 3 feet away from the guy before he finally turns away. This is not in your interests, by the way, to treat people like that. But, you've got a show, you can't truck with me, everybody watch out.
Yeah, and it's interesting that the differences you find in these sorts of studies also serve to explain for example, the differences in terms of support for gun control that exist between the North and the South, for example, right?
Right. Yeah, it's quite general. Also, there are laws against physical punishment in the schools in the North, but not in the South. I mean, perfectly okay. And in general, Southerners spank their children more, and they're toughening them up. I mean, and in general, Southerners are in favor of the U.S. war of the moment, whatever it is. The U.S. military, by the way, is a Southern institution. I mean, there are many more Southerners, proportionally, in the military than Northerners. So these are people who are at home with aggression. They do it professionally.
Okay, great. So, Dr. Nisbett, just before we finish this year, would you like perhaps to share with people where they can follow your work on the internet?
I have a book, which you mentioned before, called Mindware, Tools for Smart Thinking. And I also have a MOOC, a massive online open course, which also is called Mindware, and it says Tools for the Information Revolution. And this is something we didn't talk much about, but there are all kinds of skills that are now required, not required 100 years ago, because other people are giving us information, and we're getting information of a kind we didn't used to get. You have to have statistical understanding, you have to have microeconomic rules understood, you have to have sophisticated logic, and so on. These things are not tested on IQ tests, but you really have to have them in today's world. So this internet course shows you that. And it's intended to be entertaining, and I would encourage your viewers to take a look. And if they don't like the first 5 minutes, they're not going to like it. But it's not a heavy investment.
Okay, so I'm gonna finish the recording here. Please don't end the call, because I just want to have a quick word with you before we end the call. But Dr. Nisbett, it was really a pleasure to have you on the show and to be able to talk with you. I've been a big fan of yours for several years now, and so thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show.
Sure, I enjoyed it.
Hi everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel last February and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. To keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge. Any amount, even $1, would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons, Karen Litzke, Anne Blanchett, Perel Galarson and Lou Guerrero. Thank you very much for all.